Recht. Goed op my recht.
Bill of Rights
in it, but for me it's been meaningless so far.
It's not fair. She should look for it to me. What are you who's in the what are you talking about, Makuma?
South Africa. That's where we are experiencing most of the problems and very
disabled people. Despite the laws which aim to ensure their rights, their access to basic
some people who will discriminate and it restricts my access. I'll first of all go to management.
Other schools, they don't do that. If you can't see, then it's your...
Some South Africans. But where can people go if their rights are violated?
officials, government officials, your police, you know.
Go to the police, we can go to rights are being violated, and they have a responsibility to defend.
As my regte geskend word, geabuse.
It's because boodskap stuur in Johannesburg dat ons skool moet kry, want dit is swaar.
The government.
Government leaders shouldn't just rest on their laurels and say
Congratulate them on a job. The legislation that there is out there, because come on, we the new cabinet now, we have a person
promise they have to
for
ensure that millions more that we
having a water and electricity
about health care.
There are people in my country and also the superiority of the white man.
Apartheid, a system of web of
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, could you please take your seats? We are ready to start, and would like the following people to come and sit at the front here. The ambassador for the EU, the special representative for human rights of the EU, Mr. Rambridnidis, the Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, Mr. John Jeffrey, please. Could we all come and sit here so that we can make our conversation more organized? The Deputy Minister has just come in. The EU ambassador will probably come soon. Okay, all right. They are doing some interviews. As soon as they all are seated, then, ladies and gentlemen, we will start. Thank you. notice of today's programs. If you don't, please raise your hands. We have them there at the back. They have profiles of the people who will speak. They have a resume of the baseline survey that we are launching today, so it will make life easy for all of us if we had copies. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the Foundation for Human Rights, we would like to welcome you all to the Constitution Hill. This is a very special place for all of us. It's a venue where we continue to say to ourselves, never again. So this is where we get energy, we get energized. It's a safe space for all of us to look at the troubles we had in the past and to also come together to pledge our energy, our positive energy, our resources, not necessarily financial, but all the resources that we have, in the strength that we have, to ensure that this generation and the next generation and generations to come will never default to what happened in this nation in the past. My name is Togo Mpumlwana. I chair the board of the Foundation for Human Rights. That is why they've given me this task of standing here and making me work. I would have wanted to sit on the other side and enjoy the presentations. So we welcome you all. This is one of our largest survey that seeks to find out people's attitudes towards the constitutional rights in South Africa. We are very proud of that. When we started, we said we don't want a small sample that can be doubted. We actually want a sample that will find it very difficult for people who do not want to understand where people are thinking, how people are feeling and are thinking about human rights, to really be convinced that they ought to do something about it. So that is why we have this large survey. I would like to welcome firstly, our Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, Mr. John Jeffrey, sitting there. We would like to welcome our Ambassador of the European Union, Mr. Marcus Conaro, His Excellency, as well as our special guest who is in South Africa, who have come, who is an EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis. Was that well done? Thank you very much. Yes, 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 because I also have a surname that people always mispronounce, so I try hard to make sure that I do it right. So thank you for that accolade. We also have some ambassadors who are here and high commissioners who are here, and I've got a list before me. Please bear with me if I don't read. I'm being fed the information as people arrive. We have Mr. David Wamona from Ugandan Embassy amongst us. We have Florian Brondelik from Germany. We have Liam Mack from the Irish Embassy. We have Sydney Lichulu from the US Embassy. We have Thomas Metz from Germany again. We have Her Excellency Marisa Gerards from the Embassy of the Kingdom of Netherlands. She has arrived. Welcome. We also have the Policy Officer for Human Rights, Anna Brito Maneria. And amongst us, we also have representatives of the various government departments. Unfortunately, I don't have the list. Colleagues, you are family, so I hope you will not mind if I say representatives of government, of departments of government of the Republic of South Africa. We have representatives from the Chapter 9 institutions. We have Advocate Majola here, and I think there is another commissioner oh yes, there at the back. Please, Commissioner, you are welcome. We have members of civil society organizations in the human rights space. You are all welcome. I do hope. Thank you. That's another whispering Deputy Minister, Andre Snell, here from COCTA. You are most welcome. We have traveled this journey with him for a very, very long time. He's part of the family. Thank you very much. And if there's anybody I have not recognized, please feel welcome. We welcome all of you. We do also have people who worked very hard to make this survey a reality. They will speak to us later. Earlier in 2011, we had another survey, and that survey at the time was dealing with issues of access to justice and promotion of constitutional rights. And that was with the funding from the European Union, and so is this one as well. Then we had 20 sites, and we had 4,200 respondents from diverse backgrounds. Whereas this survey is amazing in the numbers that we have had. In the socio-economic justice for all, it's a socio-economic justice for all baseline survey. We interviewed 24,897 respondents. If you compare that with 4,200, we thought we had done it right the first time. And this time, we really wanted to reach as many people as possible. And we had 4,200 sites that we dealt with. And so this afternoon, we will learn more about this survey in terms of what people think, what their attitudes are about this, the human rights in South Africa. And also we'll hear about how they compiled the questionnaire. It was a toing and froing exercise. We were all throwing in everything we wanted to throw in, and they'll come back to us and say it is now about too much. And so it was a big task to just have the questionnaire compiled, and also to the questions that were going to be dealt with in the survey. We have a lot of confidence in the group that did the work for us. At this point, as you will see in the program, would now like to call upon our EU ambassador to kindly, we've got the write-up, but it's better if the ambassador kindly helps us with the introduction of our EU Special Representatives for Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis. I thought I had it, but this time. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. You have done a wonderful introduction already, all the VIPs and all the very good pronunciations. Stavros Lambrinidis, a friend and advocate of human rights under the auspices of the European Union, previously Foreign Minister of Greece, his home country. Most importantly, I think, someone who has the most busy schedule traveling the world. We actually have him back for the third time to engage, not just with the government and Dear Good Tomorrow on our EU-South African human rights dialogue, but also here in that context with civil society. And I think, as you will say yourself, also a proud advocate of the role the Federation is playing, also in the auspices of the two deputy ministers here. So for me, it's a very proud moment to have you back, Stavros. So, EU Special Representative Lambrinidis, you have got the microphone.
Thank you very much. Dear Marcus, distinguished European Union Ambassador here, Honourable Deputy Ministers, Chair, representatives of the South African Human Rights Commission, Chair and members of the Foundation for Human Rights, our host, representatives of the South African government, dear friends from diplomatic missions, including EU missions, and members of civil society organizations. A few months ago, I was in a country discussing with a number of university students the issue of female genital mutilation, a major topic of discussion, human rights discussion around the world. And I asked them if their country had a law that criminalized it, and they told me that it did. It was a relatively recent law. And I asked them if that law was known to people, and they told me that as civil society activists, students themselves, they knew about it, but the vast majority of people around the country didn't know. And they told me that thoughts that existed about potentially putting it down in a small, easy-to-read pamphlet explaining to women their rights might be quite challenging, because in some areas of the country, women simply could not read and would not be able to do it. And then one of them said, I have to tell you something. I am a university student. You see me here. I came from a region of my country, and I had to go through female genital mutilation, although I knew that it was not the right thing to do, and I knew that there was a law. And the reason I did it is because, frankly, if I didn't, my family would ostracize me, and my society would not let me marry. And I look at the survey, this important survey we're launching today on awareness, attitude, access to constitutional rights. Awareness is a challenge in itself, being able to make sure that people know the rights that are in the books. South Africa has one of the most advanced constitutions in the world. And yet that survey shows that there are so many rights, economic, social, cultural, civil, political, that people simply are not aware of. But then, as I was speaking with civil society before, preparing for the human rights dialogue, there were people who told me, you know what, there's an implementation problem in the country sometimes. There are some fantastic laws, but there are attitudes, there are traditional attitudes around the country that make those laws' application particularly difficult. The exceptionally important in this process is to have trained judges, trained police that can actually implement those laws, to have Chapter 9 institutions that are strong and empowered to be able to do that work. So attitudes, I know the law, but do I really understand the importance of getting it applied? And ability to access justice are key. I was informed that one of the perhaps the least respected right according to the survey is the equality before the law, which is the fundamental sort of right of justice provision. And in that sense, let me also say that it's important to recognize the work done by the paralegal advice offices in South Africa, who provide legal advice, consultation, mediation, and many other services, and have a key role to play to improve the access to justice to all women and to all men, whatever their race, their age, or their location. And they do deserve everyone's support, civil societies, governments, everyone else. Now, it's a real honor for me to be here with John. We had the chance to meet a couple of years ago during the last visit. I think the presence of two deputy ministers in South Africa at this launch highlight the great importance placed by the government on human rights, the culture of human rights, consolidating democratic institutions, developing a fruitful partnership with civil society. I am proud as a European to be able to have worked with South Africa, with the Foundation, with others in supporting this extremely important survey. The Foundation and the Foundation's achievements over 2 decades are multiple and far-reaching. To single out just 2, I'd like to mention promoting the right of access to health care services for women suffering from HIV and their children through the litigation fund. Also the National Task Team for LGBTI people, economic, social, cultural right, health, civil political rights, equality, LGBTI rights. All human rights are interrelated. All human rights are universal. All human rights have to be applied, however, in different countries, in different contexts, in different cultures. And as the Vienna Declaration for Human Rights of 25 years ago, that we're celebrating its anniversary this year as well, made very clear, we have to work together, smart, with compassion, to find out in different contexts not how to pick and choose among rights, but how to apply all rights in the most effective way. This is what I hope we'll be able to achieve as well tomorrow in our 5th round of dialoguing on human rights with the South African government, with DIRCO. We are trying in our interaction to be extremely broad with all government. Our cooperation with the Justice Ministry is extremely close and extremely strong, and a great point of pride. Our cooperation with DIRCO as well is a point of strength and pride for us. We always try to identify areas, both in our bilateral relations, but also in the multilateral scene and context, that we can make a difference. Dear friends, the multilateral scene is changing. And those of us whose DNA is grafted with human rights, you, South Africa, we, Europe, for different reasons, different historical circumstances, have an increasing responsibility to work together to ensure we can defend rights around the world. It is not just committed oppressors who are against human rights. Increasingly, you see populist leaders, strong men around the world, feeling that inclusiveness, tolerance, rule of law, all those values upon which human rights are based, are nothing more than an impediment to their ability to bend the will of their people, bend the will of their institutions, bend the will of their regions to their own. Checks and balances for them are a threat. And we have a responsibility to work together to highlight the universality of human rights, to highlight how human rights are not a problem. They are the solution to virtually every single major challenge of the 21st century, from building inclusive and peaceful societies to achieving economic development, the eradication of poverty, to promoting security. They're fundamental. Sometimes people ask me when I visit around the world, and Marcus mentioned those visits, they say sometimes, you know, who are you to talk? Look at Europe and all the challenges it faces in human rights. And they're absolutely right. Europe is facing challenges. Everyone is. In our case, the migration challenge is important to address effectively. We've done it to some extent, not in my view as fully as we should. The issue of racism and xenophobia in some of our countries is also an important one. But my answer to that question, and this is where South Africa and Europe can and should work even more closely together, is that the litmus test for human rights is not perfection. If that's what you're trying to see, no one is perfect. Now, this doesn't mean that therefore everyone is equally imperfect. But no one is perfect. So what is the litmus test? What is it that makes a difference? And my answer to that is, it is whether or not you have in place in your country, in your regions, those institutions that do not allow you to shove your imperfections under the carpet, that actually force you to try to be perfect even if you are not. Do you have independent courts that can arrest a policeman who beat up a peaceful protester and may perhaps convict them if they're guilty, even if a government doesn't want that conviction to happen? Do you have strong human rights institutions, independent ones, well-funded ones, who can bring accountability and spotlight and advice on improving? Do you have independent parliaments, a free and independent press? Do you have, perhaps first and foremost, a strong and independent civil society that can work also not only to identify challenges and to criticize, which is part of its important role of keeping our feet on the coals, but also to advise and to bridge societies in a broad way, and governments as well, to address some of the challenges. These institutions are the key. These are what ensure the checks and balances, what will ensure in healthy, strong democracies that we can continue to try to support everyone around the world who wishes to ensure that kind of resilience in their society and that kind of success. People have to know their rights. Society has to be able to embrace them, and institutions have to be able to apply them, and governments are responsible to ensure the space for all this to happen. I am very honored to be here today in South Africa in launching this survey, and I thank you so much to all of you for the remarkable work you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words, and thank you for the confidence you placed on the foundation in being able to hold hands with us towards working with civil society organization in the country to help people access their rights. So thank you for that. And we just also want to put it up front there that sometimes people say human rights is a foreign concept. And we argue that human rights is very, very fundamental, in that to us it is simply being human. Ubuntu. A human being, in most languages, when you say to a person, this person is a human being, you are actually saying this person knows what it means to live peacefully, respectfully, and with understanding with other people. So those who still ask questions about the concept should just go back to basics on what it means to be a human being. And so as we launch this survey, we are not proud, as you said, we're not a perfect country. We're not proud of some of the things that are happening in our country. We're still disappointed about some of the occurrences in our spaces. And amongst the examples that is quite recent here is an example of that small little child who fell into a toilet. It just should not be in South Africa. We've got communities that should be checking in accessing their rights, being aware that my child should not go to school where the toilet will kill my child. And so we must accept that maybe not the survey will show us that people actually don't realize that they've got the power to make a demand to have a proper toilet. And secondly, we've got leaders in a school who should be making sure that they write procurement properly so that there is a toilet in a school, so that a child doesn't fall into a pit toilet in 2018. So we are not proud of some of the things that had happened, but as you say, it is, no society is perfect. And so we will continue, and we continue to work towards ensuring that people access their rights. At this point, I will then ask the Deputy Minister of Justice to speak, and as he's standing, he does not want me to read what is there about him, because he says you can read. But one thing I must say is that this Deputy Minister is an activist Deputy Minister, and he tries very much to make sure that even at night you can SMS and WhatsApp him, he will respond, because he knows that we have access to him. He knows why he's in that position. He's in that position so that he can be an activist DM. So thank you. Over to you, dear.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So, Program Director, Ms. Toko Mpumlwana, the Chair of the Foundation for Human Rights, and the other board members of the Foundation for Human Rights, the EU's Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, and representatives from the EU and other ambassadors that are here, the EU ambassador in particular to the Republic of South Africa, Dr. Marcus Conado, the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, Professor Bongani Majola, the CEO of the Foundation for Human Rights, Ms. Yasmin Suka, Deputy Minister Andries Nel, and the former Statistician General of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. Pali Lekgotla. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends. There's always something allegorical or almost mystical about Constitution Hill, which is where we're gathered. If one reads about it on the constitutionhill.org website, it says there's perhaps no other site of incarceration in South Africa, but I would argue in the world, that imprisoned the sheer number of world-renowned men and women as those held within the wall of Constitution Hill's Old Fort, Women's Jail, and Number 4. Nelson Mandela, Albert Luthuli, Robert Sobukwe, Mahatma Gandhi, Joe Slovo, Albertina Sisulu, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Fatima Mia were all imprisoned here. This past weekend, Constitution Hill, in partnership with Human Rights and the Social Justice Fraternity, presented the inaugural Human Rights Festival. The festival included 3 days of activism, debates, art, culture, exhibitions, books, poetry, comedy, film, and music. There was a music festival, a poetry festival, a film festival, and a book fair. At the book fair, one of the featured books was the autobiography of well-known struggle author and poet Don Matera. South Africa History Online provides a glimpse of the life of the struggle writer. He was born in Western Native Township, now called Westbury. His grandfather was an Italian immigrant who married a Xhosa or Khoisan woman from the Cape. Matera's father was classified Italian by the authorities, while his mother was a Botswana domestic worker in Johannesburg. Matera grew up in the mixed area of Sophiatown, and it was during the campaign against the removals of black, colored, and Indians from Sophiatown that Matera became a political activist. As a result of his political activities, he was banned by the apartheid government and spent a number of years under house arrest. His autobiography, which was featured at the book fair, is called Memory is the Weapon, and I'd like to read an extract from it. Once a policeman called at our home to inform us that one of our relations, 1B Matera, had been arrested for a past offense. I hurried down thinking it was my father because his initials were BG. I saw a man called Basil inside the prison courtyard. I inquired whether he'd seen my father because our information was that a B Matera had been arrested. He smiled sheepishly, almost remorsefully, and said, "I hope you don't mind, Donnie, but I gave them my name as Basil Matera. Please tell that Boer over there that I'm your uncle." His voice fell to a pleading whisper. "Meneer," I said to the obese desk sergeant, "that man over there is my uncle. He's colored. Can you please release him?" The policeman shook with derisive bursts of laughter. "If he's your uncle, then I was the bloody midwife." His laughter rang through my ears into my stomach and fell deep into the soles of my feet. Suddenly a group of men moved out of the queue to speak to a man at the exit point of the reclassification office. Amid quiet whispers and the shaking of heads, I detected concern on their faces. One by one they moved towards the huge gates, all of them touching their hair. I approached one of them. "Excuse me, big man, what's happening? Why are you guys all pulling your hair like that, and where are you going?" "To the barber shop, boy. We're all dashing out for a haircut." "Why?" Pointing over his shoulder with his thumb, he said, "Those bastards in there, those dogs are using matchsticks and pens to classify us." "Matchsticks, pens?" "Yes," came the quick response. "Matchsticks and fucking pens, which they run through our hair. And when the pen or matchstick gets stuck, the Boer shouts, 'Go to room 47 and get a pass.'" His words stung everyone into silence. People began looking at each other's heads. Those with soft, straight hair smiled confidently. and one or two actually combed their heavily greased hair to the open envy of some of the more curly-haired, who were now vanishing from the queue. A very dark-skinned man smiled quietly. He'd shaved off all his hair. Matchsticks and pens cannot get stuck on a bald head. Heart-rending stories filled with biting humiliation and anguish daily made newspaper headlines in the late 50s. Some victims of the reclassification trauma chose suicide to bail them out of their absurd misery. Whole and stable families were shattered overnight as brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters were ripped apart by the cruel laws of race separation. The dark and fair-skinned Gabriel brothers were split, one to pure and the other to native pigeonholes, and never the twain to meet in the same township or in the same house. This was the law. So, ladies and gentlemen, with all these people, Matera, Mandela, Sisulu, Slovo, and all the others imprisoned here have in common is that they were striving for the same ideal, a nation built on democracy, freedom, and equality, and a constitution to guarantee fundamental human rights. Today we need to protect and promote those hard-won freedoms and human rights. Part of doing so means strengthening our efforts to transform the justice system through developing and implementing policies that bring about improved access to justice and making people aware of their rights. As much as our Constitution has been lauded across the globe as being a highly progressive and transformative one, a progressive Constitution alone will not realize rights if people living within our country do not understand what it entails. It is imperative for us to ensure that every person within our borders knows and understands the Constitution. Many people in South Africa are poor and live in rural areas of the country and are often the most vulnerable, with women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons being exposed to violence and related harm. Whilst efforts have been made by the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, in collaboration with civil society organizations, to educate people about their rights and responsibilities, much still needs to be done. The Foundation for Human Rights is a valued partner in our efforts. The Socio-Economic Justice for All baseline survey's final sample consisted of 24,897 interviews and provides us with very useful information in order to assess where we stand on constitutional and human rights awareness. Later this afternoon, we'll have a presentation on the findings and recommendations of the survey, but there are three areas I want to highlight. First, there's the issue of constitutional awareness. Respondents were asked if they'd heard of the Constitution of South Africa and if they'd heard of the Bill of Rights in Chapter 2 of the Constitution. Slightly more than half, 51% of respondents, had heard of either. Male respondents were more likely, that's 55%, than their female counterparts at 47%, to have heard either of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. With regard to the race of respondents, whites were the most likely at 68% to have heard of either, followed by Indian or Asian respondents, 61%. While the majority, that's 56% of coloreds, had heard of either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, less than half, that's 48% of black African respondents, had heard of either. What this tells us is there's still an enormous task ahead of us in raising levels of constitutional and human rights awareness. If persons or communities are not even aware of their rights, how can they possibly enforce them? The second area, and one which is the subject of much debate and discourse in our country at the moment, is the issue of land. Almost three-quarters, 72% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that land should be returned to black people where it was taken away. As one would expect, there were differences across race. While 77% of black Africans agreed, this was true for 63% of coloreds, 61% of Indians, and less than half, but not, 45% of whites. Rural residents were more likely at 77% to agree that those living in urban, 73%, or metropolitan, 67% areas. However, despite these levels of support for returning land to black people where it was taken away, three-quarters of all adults agreed that no one should be allowed to take their land away from them or their families. The findings were consistent across men and women, as well as across black Africans at 74%, colored 77%, Indians or Asians 76%, and whites at 73%. So what this tells us is that government's approach to the issue of land is the correct approach, that there's no simple solution. And I want to echo the words of President Ramaphosa in Parliament when he said, and I quote, "We're going to handle this matter in the way we've always handled difficult issues in our country, by dialogue, discussion, engagement, until we find good solutions that will take our country forward. South Africans must therefore navigate this issue not by fear or distrust. Their choices must reflect their hopes, not their fears. Some have become very hopeful, some have become very fearful. It is a question that we will continue to handle with care and responsibility as government." The third issue I want to touch on is the issue of whether people feel that they're being heard. One of the areas that respondents were specifically asked about is civic engagement and enforcing their rights. They were asked how easy or difficult they thought it was to do the following: to contact their local councillor if they wanted to express their point of view, to contact a member of parliament if they want to express their point of view, to challenge a violation of their rights in court, to approach the Constitutional Court directly to assert their rights, and lastly, to lodge a complaint with a Chapter 9 institution, such as the Public Protector or the Human Rights Commission. Some 56% of respondents thought that contacting their local councillor was very difficult or difficult. The highest proportion of respondents, and that's 88%, thought that contacting a member of parliament was the most difficult. Some 76% thought it was difficult or very difficult to challenge a violation of their rights in court, while 82% thought it was difficult or very difficult to approach the Constitutional Court. Some 82% thought it was difficult or very difficult to lodge a complaint with a Chapter 9 body like the South African Human Rights Commission or the Public Protector. So what these figures show is that people generally feel that enforcing their rights is either difficult or very difficult. More than 2 decades after the dawn of democracy, this shouldn't be so. In fact, active citizenship is a fundamental pillar of the National Development Plan and goes to the heart of the developmental state. And this is why the baseline survey is so useful. The information will greatly assist in helping us as government to focus on and tailor-make our policies and programs where they're most needed and where they can have the biggest impact. It helps us as government to further partner with civil society in bringing about socio-economic change. It would also be useful to compare the findings of this baseline survey to those of the previous baseline survey, which, as you heard, was undertaken in 2011. Of course, we would not have been able to do this without the support of the Foundation for Human Rights and the European Union. And that is why we value our partnership with the EU and the FHR, a partnership that has literally touched the lives of millions of our people. In 1996, a partnership between the EU and the government of the Republic of South Africa established the European Union Foundation for Human Rights to implement the joint program on human rights. The agreement underscored the commitment of both the South African government and the EU to the promotion and protection of human rights and democratic principles. The previous program, the Access to Justice and Promotion of Human Rights program, was funded by the EU through the budget support to an amount of 25 million euros and funded more than 600 projects targeting vulnerable and marginalized groups. Amongst its achievements, the program succeeded in reaching an audience of 9 million persons through the popular education programs on constitutional rights, raising awareness of rights amongst 360,000 farm workers and farm dwellers, and increasing their access to justice, supporting the diversion of 10,000 persons from prison, and ensuring that 5,400 civil society organization members benefited from capacity building programs. The program has also supported more than 100 community-based advice offices, ensured that more than 100,000 migrants were provided with legal support services, and more than 1,300 civil society organizations were able to engage in formal dialogues with the state. Under the program, more than 200 workshops were held with the human rights sector, which include migration, hate crimes, combating racism and xenophobia, gender-based violence, disability and discrimination and exclusion. The Socio-Economic Justice for All program, which is the current program, is also supported by the EU through a sector budget support modality. Its main focus is on constitutional rights awareness, with emphasis on socio-economic rights, supporting Outcome 14, that's social cohesion of the medium-term strategic framework and the National Development Plan. Key indicators are included in our department's annual performance plan, and the duration of the program is from 2014 to this year, 2018, with a closeout next year in 2019. And as we're nearing the end of the SEDJA program, we have to find innovative ways to continue the valuable work being done. And there is still much to be done. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude in the spirit of the Human Rights Festival, and since we are next to the women's jail, with a poem from another anti-apartheid activist and Robben Island poet, Dennis Brutus, called Today in Prison. Today in prison, by tacit agreement, they will sing just one song, Nkosi Sikelel, solemnly and slowly, with suppressed passion and pent-up feeling. The voice is strong and steady, but with tears close and sharp behind the eyes, and the mind ranging wildly as a strayed bird, seeking some names to settle on and deeds being done. And those who will do the much that still needs to be done. So let us be amongst those who will do the much that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. DM, I also go to church. And so in church, there is a tendency when someone says really something you want to hear, you keep saying, So I've been saying when the two speakers, I kept saying, I'm convincing myself that that point really. So thank you very much for that motivation and energizing us during this Human Rights Month, also because there are times when human rights defenders feel deflated. And so occasions like these are to say to you, don't give up. Don't give up because you are on the right track, because all you want and all we want is a just society. Thank you very much. This is now the end of the first session. What you have been waiting for is going to happen now. We are going to hear about the survey. So I think I would like to ask our panelists, please give them the last round of applause to sit here, because I think you'll use a screen. Am I correct? Yes, so that they can see what is happening there. I will now call on the next group. Yasmin, where are you? She'll say more about the baseline survey. Yasmin also is our executive director at the Foundation for Human Rights, and you'll read about her long story of life in the booklet that you have. And then from Citizen Survey, we want Ms. Washiela Capri, who has done a sterling job. She will also explain to us what they did. And representing the Foundation for Human Rights, I will say so, is Gerald O'Sullivan, who was our key person, and we still claim him. Even if he's no longer with us, he's part of us forever. So I'll hand over now to Yasmin to tell us about the survey. Thank you. There's a car which is blocking the delivery way, DG58JB, GP is a Jeep. Again, DG58JBGP, it's a Jeep. It's closing the entrance, so there is a delivery van that can't come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm not going to repeat the welcomes. I think the chairperson and everybody has done that. So I would say that protocol has been observed. But I would like to thank all of you who have come today to join us in actually celebrating the launch of one of the most comprehensive surveys done in South Africa on attitudes, awareness, and access to human rights. I'd also like to remember two great South Africans who passed on this year. Hugh Masekela, who played an important role in dealing with Pan-Africanism and migration, and of course the late Peter Blanche for his work on poverty and inequality. Now, the Foundation for Human Rights has in the past carried out a number of attitudinal surveys on human rights awareness, access, and attitudes. The first survey took place after the dawn of democracy, and the last one in 2011, which focused on 22 communities. And at that point, amongst marginalized communities, the levels of awareness of the Constitution was 47%. The current survey, of course, using the Stats South Africa methodology, has found that awareness across marginalized communities has, of course, improved. But I think a more worrying question is, why is there such a low level of awareness amongst women, less than 50%? And I think that's a bit of a challenge. While the team here will speak about the methodology, I think what's important is to talk about the partnership that took place, which gave rise really to the development of the questionnaire, the methodology, and of course the question of sampling and the field work. This time around, we wanted it to be a partnership, and so we involved Stats South Africa, the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, the Chapter 9s, and of course this committee was chaired by Ushara Siupol of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and we also brought in a number of universities because what we wanted it to be was something that everybody in the country who works in the human rights and social justice sector would in fact be able to use. Stats South Africa also asked us to include questions on good governance and democracy, you know, something that they've been trying to roll out in the region. And so when you read the survey, you will find that in fact there are a number of questions around democracy and a number of findings which really, I think, go to where the pulse of our country is at this moment. You actually feel the despondency of people in the way in which they responded to the questions. So while everybody agrees that the Constitution is the best that we can have, many of them are unhappy with the state of democracy in our country. And when you look at the question of accountability, I think there was a general sense that the accountability of state institutions to the people of South Africa remains a challenge. And one group that came in for particular critique was, of course, parliamentarians. I think one of the important findings also relates to the question of how people's levels of awareness are also linked to the question of their economic status and how they feel about whether the Constitution has in fact been working for them. And so as we move forward, I think this question of not just raising awareness, but also raising questions of where do you actually go to access your rights, and what is the government doing around the question of prevention? I think these are important questions that we take forward. The one thing that we realize is that we have to keep on raising awareness and promoting the Constitution. And so I think when we end today's session, we're also going to launch a pilot, 2 of the pilots around an animation series on constitutional awareness, which we will roll out in schools. It has a teacher training curriculum, and it's 2 minutes, so you can actually download it on your smartphone. We're going to be putting it onto community television and community radio. And what's been interesting about it is how the characters have been developed with young people who actually feel that this is an important way to go. The data set, of course, of the survey, and I don't want to spoil what they're going to say, but there is such an enormous amount of data that you can cut in so many different ways, so many different demographics around age, race, rural, urban, peri-urban. And given that there were 85 questions in the survey, this is probably one of the richest resources for South African researchers. And so we are looking at technology to put this on an open source portal. And we will also be asking for submissions on abstracts so that other researchers can drill down deeper into the data. Of course, equality and race remain key issues in our country, and as we ended Racism Week, it's not surprising that most people talk about discrimination being an issue they face, particularly on racial grounds. Some of them say this is in public spaces, others comment that this is in the workplace, and interestingly enough for women, they talk about discrimination in the home. And I think that's a finding that has to be really probed. Now, of course, South Africa has what we call a Rolls-Royce constitution, but what we don't have is a Rolls-Royce economy and institutional structures to really deliver on the constitution. While we have both vertical and horizontal application of the Constitution, the truth of the matter is we have hardly tackled the question of the private sector. And what we are finding out, certainly when you look at the question of the distinction between the private and the public, particularly in education and healthcare, there's a real need to build solidarity and, of course, subsidiarity between the private and the public. Otherwise, I don't think we will see dramatic changes in South Africa. This morning, a school in Port Elizabeth was found to have allowed an NGO to carry out HIV and AIDS testing on pupils without the consent of their parents. And as we grappled with this, I was asking myself the question, would this have happened in a former Model C school? Would it have happened in a private school? And the reason it wouldn't is because you have much more aggressive, active SG, these school governing boards. But when you look at more impoverished schools, the difficulty is you have many parents who are working, who can't make time to be in those governing boards. And that then means that there's no real accountability on many of these questions. So this is Human Rights Month in our country. And as we remember and commemorate the Sharpeville massacre, I thought it appropriate that I end with a quote from the late Robert Sobukwe, who was also a prisoner here, who wrote, and I quote, "Here is a tree rooted in African soil, nourished with waters from Africa. Come and sit under this tree." I find the symbolism of the tree very, very moving. And if you go down to the Constitutional Court, one of the symbols is, in fact, a tree. And in my view, what we have to look at is how do we have South Africans, in fact, be those leaves sitting on the branch, which then, in fact, form the whole of the tree. Because if we really want to make a difference, I think all of us have to come to the party. And in the words of Robert Sobukwe, this is what we need to do if we want to nourish the tree completely. Finally, I would like to thank both the Department of Justice and the European Union for making our work and that of civil society in South Africa possible. If you look at the events of the last year, to be very, very frank, while this is not acknowledged in the way that it should be, we have to ask that if civil society had not come out on the streets in the way that they did and say that enough is enough, could we have been in the position we are in now, where we actually begin to have a lot more optimism about the sense of governance in the country? But the struggle, of course, is far from over. And what it needs is vigilance. And what we need to do is to use the Constitution in the kind of way that we envisaged when we finalized it many, many years ago. The Constitution is truly a progressive tool. But in my view, We have yet to use it as that kind of tool to combat the kind of society that we are still living through today. So while there have been great changes and tremendous strides, to be very frank, we cannot realize the equality in the Constitution. People can't be free if they can't eat. And food security in our country is a problem. Poverty and inequality remain at the most obscene and grotesque levels compared to anywhere else in the world. I think we rival Brazil at this particular moment. So honestly, the Constitution is there for the taking, but we need to take it up and to use it because it is the one weapon we have. And every time we hear from the judges on the Constitutional Court on issues, you can see the Constitution being used in the way in which it was envisaged many, many years ago. Thank you very, very much, and to the team as well.
Just go into my presentation. Oh, okay. Yeah, that one. There we go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to tell you how we went about conducting this significant and important survey. Okay. Sorry, just trying to get used to this laptop here. Okay, so basically we're going to be covering the importance of scientific sampling and how we designed the sample, how we went about selecting the areas to conduct the interviews in, the households that we visited, and the actual people that we conducted the interviews with. We'll also talk a little bit about the fieldwork challenges. Fieldwork is never without its challenges. And then also, just to give some context to the time period in which this data was collected, we will tell you about some of the significant events that took place in South Africa. With any survey, the key issues always, when you look at the findings of the survey, is how accurate and how reliable is this information? What is it that we can know for certain? And that is why one of the key factors that determines if your survey is going to produce accurate results is your sample. Research that is based or that is premised on a poorly designed sample, as my esteemed colleagues, our former statistician general and Dr. Zaid Kimi, who I learned sampling from, can testify. If research is based on a poorly designed sample or poorly designed methodologies, then it is going to produce misleading results. And so it is critical that your sampling has to follow scientific rigor and that scientific principles have to be applied. It is thus that the sample was designed as a probability sample and not as a non-probability or a convenient sample, because we wanted to look at the mathematical and the scientific rigor so that we could produce, or rather have, greater accuracy, better representativity, and also so that we can have greater clarity about how important a given finding is. We also, most of all, wanted to ensure that we could draw inferences about the entire adult population and not only about the sample of the 24,897 people that we interviewed, but rather about the adult South African adult population, which is around about 36 to 37 million. So the sample, as we said, it was drawn as a nationally representative and a stratified probability sample. Stratification is important because you want to ensure that you can cover the important variables in your population, such as race, age, the geographic lay of the land. If you consider that a lot of surveys are undertaken and we never hear the voices of people in our deep rural areas and in our far-flung areas. So we wanted to ensure that we could get coverage of the entire country. And so we visited every nook and cranny of this country. As we know, South Africa is not a homogeneous society. It is probably one of the most diverse in the world. And if we had to apply equal probability sampling, we would have ended up with a sample that would not have given us enough resolution on our minority groups and on our vulnerable groups and communities, on our smaller provinces or on our bigger provinces like the Northern Cape, where the population is dispersed all over the province. We also applied weighting in that we were able to desample person and household weights. That meant that we could extrapolate or generalize the results or the findings of the survey to the entire population. Our sample had an overall precision of 1% with a 95% confidence. So that means your result would fall between -1 and +1. We also used what we call a multi-stage sampling approach. So in the first stage of sampling, we then, just to talk about the sample frame that we used. Aside from following the scientific rigor, according to Stats SA, we also use the census sampling frame because the census provides the best coverage of our entire population. And so we use the census EA sampling frame. Now, EAs or enumeration areas are used for census purposes, and they're generally the smallest geographic area for which population statistics are available. In some cases, an EA could be 3 or 4 blocks in the city. In other areas, if you go out into rural areas, it could be huge. But we also used what we call the measurement of size. So we looked at what was the size of the EA, and we used scientific methods, which is probability proportionate to size, to be able to select the EAs that we were going to visit in the country. So we didn't just randomly select these EAs and say we want to visit this and that one, but this was done through a scientific process. Within each EA, we selected 6 dwellings that we visited. But again, there was a scientific approach that was used here, and we used Stats SA has got a sample frame of all the dwellings in the country, the dwelling units. And so from there, we systematically selected 6 of these dwellings within an EA, and we said this is where the interview has to be conducted. But our technology also enabled us to be able to program the GIS coordinates of those dwelling units into the questionnaire script. So what this meant is that the interviewer had to be in that particular EA and had to be at that particular dwelling before that questionnaire would open. In that way, we could ensure that the correct EAs and the correct dwelling units were sampled. Then, very often also what happens is that you might have multiple households living in one dwelling. And we often find this happening in poorer areas where it is better for people to be able to club together, and you would then have all of them eating out of the same pot. We also find that we have a lot of backyard dwellers, And so we had to have a system for ensuring that we also counted those backyard dwellings in our sampling selection. The fourth stage was then selecting the person in the household to be interviewed. So you couldn't just go along and interview anyone who opened the door, because that would have meant that you were going to interview mainly females who are at home, older and indigent people, and unemployed people, and maybe students and so on. So we applied another scientific method, which is the cash grid. It is commonly used, but again, that was pre-programmed into the electronic questionnaire. So when you got to the household, all the names of the adults were listed, and then the tablet or the program automatically selected the person in the household who had to be interviewed. And 3 visits had to be made to a particular household or a particular respondent before substitution could take place. Because, I mean, obviously, people do have a choice, and they can say, you know, they can refuse if they want to be interviewed or not. Obviously, we had, I'll tell you about how we try to improve those participation rates as well. The interviews were obviously done on a face-to-face basis, and we used 10-inch tablets. The devices were preloaded, as we said, with the maps and with the EA coordinates and the coordinates of the dwelling units. We also had built-in validation checks that were built into the program. So that means that we had timestamps. We could see approximately how long an interview would take. And in that way, we could mitigate against skeleton interviewing, because, as we know in research, this is the type of thing that happens. We also had date stamps, and we had time stamps, so we could see when interviewers were actually conducting the interviews. Later on in the survey, we were also able to conduct audio recordings. As technology became available, we could conduct audio recordings, which is absolutely amazing, because it means that you can immediately verify and check the quality of the data. The questionnaire, very important, was translated into all of the official languages. And again, here we followed a rigorous process. We do what is called double-blind translation. So we do a forward translation, and then we do a back translation. And the translations are done by two different individuals, and we then compare the results. It is very important to have proper translations in place, and people were given an opportunity. So all these translations were overlaid on the tablet. And once you started the interview, you could say to the person, which language do you prefer to be interviewed in? And immediately we could then call up the questionnaire in that particular language. It's becoming incredibly difficult to conduct interviews, particularly in your metro areas where you have gated communities. In your rural areas, it is a problem to gain access to farms and so on. So basically, time is a problem. People don't have a lot of time to sit down for interviews, and security is a big issue as well. So in order to be able to increase our participation rates, I mean, the first thing that we do already is that we always use people from the same communities. It is part of empowering those communities, providing them with skills training, and also providing them with employment. This helps to overcome a lot of the access issues in rural areas, particularly where you have traditional leaders and so on. In metro areas, it is a problem to gain access to these gated communities. So we engaged a PR company, and we used a combination of traditional methods, media and so on, and we also used a lot of the social media. We also engaged with the managing agents of these body corporates and of these gated communities. And at the end, we achieved a high level of success because we were able to complete interviews in 4,165 EAs, and we completed, out of the 25,000, we completed 24,897 interviews. We also provided employment to about 468 field workers around the country. And then just on the last point, significant events that occurred during the fieldwork period was the release of the state capture report by the public prosecutor. There was also the Fees Must Fall protest, and there were school protests that were also taking place, and also the inquiries into the state-owned enterprises. We also, in terms of our fieldwork, we also encountered many areas where protests were taking place. But it meant that we had to revisit these areas, and in some cases we also had to call the police in to be able to assist us to access these areas. I'm now going to hand over to Gerald, who will tell you a bit more about the findings of the study. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Washila. Where's AJ? I want AJ to get the slides up for me. Madam Chair, Deputy Ministers, Mr. Lamridis, Ambassador, and Professor Majola, honored guests and friends, great, thanks. I'm pleased after all this time we're able to present these results. It's going to be difficult to do justice to the work that was done by Washila and her team, because the data set, as Yasmin said, is absolutely enormous, and we can't cut the analysis in any which way. So as I present, and there's an issue that's close to your heart and you haven't seen a slide about it, it's either in the pack, in the report that's in the pack. We try to get as many of the more interesting findings in the pack. Then also after this gathering, you will get a USB stick with a fuller report on it, which was written by my colleague Ross Jennings, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today because he's in Swaziland. So at best, all I can call these some preliminary findings. Thanks, Washila, also for giving some of the background behind this, because without that kind of statistical rigor and that scientific approach to it, some of these findings may be provocative or disputed. So if you dispute the finding, you have to dispute the data set or dispute the wording of the question. But you can't dispute the fact that what the numbers tell you, and these numbers tell you something. And as you dig into the numbers, you find some counterintuitive results, and then you immediately want to dig deeper into it. Why is the result in Limpopo different from Western Cape? And that's where the richness of the data set comes in, because you can cut the data. You can cut it then by population group. You find in Western Cape there's a different population demographic, so therefore it pushes the result in a different way than it would in Limpopo. Or cut it by gender or age cohort. Older folk feel differently about issues than younger folk. So there's an enormous amount of work that has to go on after we've presented these results, and after you've read the full report on the USB stick. The other thing I want to just re-emphasize is the point that Yasmin made. We try to make sure that this was a multi-stakeholder project. We were very keen to work very closely with Stats SA. So ourselves as FHR, Department of Justice, DPME, and Stats SA, we worked very closely with Dr. Isabel Schmidt at Stats SA and with Ushara Supol and her team at Department of Justice. Now, Yasmin mentioned the earlier 2001 study, and so did the Deputy Minister, but that was a site-specific survey where Dr. Kimi deliberately targeted the most vulnerable and marginalized of societies to say, do you understand that there's a constitution that should protect your rights? So, and the finding was that it was less than 50% of folk had heard of the constitution. But then people were using that figure to say, nationally, this is the national picture, which is also not the case, because middle-class people may have better or less awareness of the constitution. So that was the spur behind this study, was to go as broad as possible, to get the biggest population we could in that space of time, we tried to finish before the Christmas break. So Washila's team was under enormous pressure to finish before the 16th of December because we didn't want people to go away and then come back with a different mood because they've been on the beach or with their family and feel differently about issues. So we're trying to take that snapshot in our history between, I think it was September and November. So it was a very specific time in our history, and we remember the pain that we were in politically last year. We would probably get slightly different results if we did that now in March 2018. So the survey design, we did do a long process of looking through at previous surveys, the kinds of questions that were asked, the results that were found, where the gaps were, and where we could take this opportunity to fill those gaps with this bigger survey. And we were very careful to align it with the work that Stats SA has done, particularly around this bigger initiative called the Strategy for the Harmonization of Statistics in Africa. We were also on that with stakeholders in government and the Chapter 9 institutions, particularly the Commission for Gender Equality and the Human Rights Commission. And we made a special attempt to reach civil society organizations like Section 27, Socio-Economic Rights Institute, SERI, Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, and the Black Sash. And we worked closely with the Constitutional Rights Working Group that's the Human Rights Commission is chairing. So we built on these previous studies. As Washila said, we did the questionnaire, workshopped it, back translated it to make sure that it was accessible to all folk in their mother tongues, and then loaded it on these the computer-based personnel interviewing software. And we were very excited by the technology that Washila's team used, because we were worried that maybe you'd get, you know, field workers would sit in the local wimpy bar arbitrarily filling out the thing, trying to make up their quota. But we're pretty sure that the rigor and the technology and the hard work by the field workers lends itself to the richness of the data set. There were 95 questions, which sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but we try to make sure that it fitted in within 45 minutes, so you don't get, you know, questionnaire fatigue, and then the guys are saying, yeah, I strongly agree, no, I don't agree, yes, sir, you know, just to get the interview over and done with. So we were very careful to time it so that we were getting good quality responses. So the first part of the questionnaire was to get some sort of demographics of the household. And as Washila said, we were very careful to make sure we asked questions to try and reach the backyard dwellers, and then ask them questions about their sanitation, access to water, the kinds of questions that Dr. Lehohla would ask in the general household survey. Because we wanted to make sure that when we compared the demographics of this sample, that it was comparable to the kinds of surveys that Stats SA were doing, so we could extrapolate the results of the nation as a whole by applying the weightings. So we know in an enumerator area, there's a certain number of people who are of a certain age. If we multiply by such a weighting figure, we know that that is representative of that group of people in that area. Then we asked them questions on democracy and human rights, on their socio-political attitudes, because we also want to understand what are people's attitudes towards human rights. Not only are you protected by them, but, you know, what are your attitudes towards gay and lesbian rights or gender rights, and so on. We asked them about civic engagement and participation, because it's all very well having a good constitution, but if you don't have access to the mechanisms which protect your rights, it means nothing. So we wanted to understand, where do people go to if they've got problems in the household or problems with their partner? Where do they go for protection? We asked then about people's experience of discrimination, humiliation, as a proxy for having your human rights violated. So we asked them, have you ever felt discriminated on the basis of your gender, your age, your sexuality, or your race? And then we asked questions around peace and security, again, to align it with the work that Stats SA did. The sampling frame, I'm not going to touch on that because Washila did that, but the important thing is that the randomness of the sample was so important, because you want to be able to ensure there's no loaded questions, that the survey is not biased in one direction or another. And the most important thing is that when we finished the survey and plotted on a map based on the spatial coordinates that were captured, the surveys, you can see on the map there, it really represents exactly the population density of South Africa. So we know that we reached all areas. You can see little dots from the far, far north. You can see around the border of Swaziland, enormous numbers of people living there that, to be honest, I didn't even know there were such high population densities there. And then if you look on the left there, you can see all these communities living along the Orange River. So we know we reached pretty much everywhere in South Africa that we could have. Now, the first thing that we did was to compare this with Stats SA data, because we wanted to be sure that our demographics were comparable, because we do want to make sure that we didn't unexpectedly find we've got too many women or too many old folk or too many rural people as opposed to urban people. So we compared results. On the left is the results that the General Household Survey produced. On the right is what we produced from the SEJA Household Survey. So by population group, we ask people, how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as white or colored or Indian or black African? And we found that the percentage was almost exactly the same. 78% black African on both sides, 9% colored, nearly 3% Indians and Asians, and roughly 10% white. And we went through this process comparing age cohorts as well. Are we reaching the same groups of age? Are we reaching the same number of old people, young people, and middle-aged folk? You'll see very few people under the age of 18. That's because just in terms of the ethics of doing survey data, you don't include people under the age of 18. So one of the questions that Washida's folk had to do was ask how old. So when they did the Kish grid and they found the person in the household, they want to ask you the question, if they were under the age of 18, then they had to redo the sampling. So again, the age cohorts were comparable. The types of dwellings that we reached were comparable. So we know we also did many other stats. I'm not going to go through all of the comparisons that we did, but at the end of it, we felt this is a robust sample. So what did we find? The most important finding that the Deputy Minister touched on already is, have you heard of either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights? Barely 50% have heard of either, which is up from the 47% that the 2011 survey found, but only marginally so. We then cut this by race and age to try and see what the difference was between the different age groups and the self-identified by race. And you'll see, for example, with the blue bars, I want to walk to their points, but I can't walk over through the mic. I just want to show you with African folk, you'll see that you see the blue bar in each of the groups. It steadily goes down. You'll see that it starts at 57 on the far left and then steps down by age. So you start to see by age, black African, the older you are, the less you likely have heard of the Constitution. Whereas with whites, it actually goes the other way. So when you're cutting the data, you have to be very careful how you analyze it. So you might say, oh, everyone knows the Constitution, but you look by race, it's actually very uneven. And these are the kinds of questions that the survey data is going to generate more questions actually than answers. So don't come to me afterwards and say, but why? I don't know why. It's only when you dig into the data that you'll find out why. By province, KwaZulu-Natal was the worst. Only 45% of people in KwaZulu-Natal had heard of either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. It was highest in the Western Cape. And again, you could ask yourselves questions, is it because KwaZulu-Natal has a lot of rural areas, or is it because there's more traditional leaders there in KZN? And that's where researchers would have to go and look more closely into it. By age, as you can see, there's a steady drop-off. And this is a nice question for the Department of Basic Education. Is this because of the good work that they are doing in terms of constitutional rights awareness, making sure that kids are more aware of constitutional rights? And I know that Commissioner Amin Mir and the DBE have been trying to get the copies of the Constitution to every grade 12 kid, so that when they'll go back home, they've got that in their hands. And then they're more likely to tell their parents about it. And in that way, you spread constitutional rights awareness. But it is worrying that older folk, but again, it's probably because of our history. The Live Poverty Index, we drew this from Afrobarometer, where we asked people, how often have you gone without a cash income, without electricity, without water? We wanted to have an indicator where people's, what we call their lived poverty experience, and then ask them, because we wanted to find out, do poor people understand their rights? But how do you measure poverty? It's not good using GDP or monetary value. We wanted to measure it by their own lived experience of poverty. So we asked these 6 questions and then developed an indicator and then asked the question again, have you heard of the Constitution or Bill of Rights? And then looked at it by lived poverty index. And on the left, people who have not experienced poverty, they are most likely to have heard of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And on the left, only 30% of people, the poorest, have heard of either the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. We also then asked, of those people who had heard of either, had they heard of Chapter 9 institutions? Because Chapter 9 institutions were established to protect your rights. That's why the CGE exists. That's why the Human Rights Commission exists. So of those who were aware, we asked them, of those who said, I have heard of the Constitution, we asked them, have you heard of any Chapter 9 institutions? And the vast majority had not heard of them. 68% of people said no. Only 18% said, I've heard of a Chapter 9 institution. We then asked them, if you have heard of one, can you name any? So unprompted, very few people could name any of the Chapter 9 institutions. But when we asked them, have you heard of the Auditor General? Yes, then 30% said, yes, I've heard of the Auditor General. Have you heard of the CRL Commission? Yes. 38% I said I've heard of it. And the most popular one, the one that most people knew about was the IEC, and obviously because local elections were happening around the time of the survey. So it was obviously large in people's minds. And also because Thuli Madonsela had been so in the news, the Office of the Public Protector was very well known. But again, it's a problem because people don't know about these institutions, that they protect human rights, and yet so few people know about them. Of those who had heard of them, we then asked, which is the most important? And a lot of folks had just said all of them are important. But the interesting, the one that most people thought the most important was the Human Rights Commission. So again, why is it they've heard, they think it's more important than the Public Protector? Because the Public Protector, you'd have thought, does great work as well, or the IEC. But so these are the questions for further research. I think the Auditor General is very low because most of the public don't really know of the Auditor General, but those of us in government, obviously the Auditor General looms large in our mind because we're always worried about audits, but amongst civilians or the people out there, that's, it's not really, doesn't loom large in their minds. Okay, attitudes to the Constitution. We did ask, bearing in mind the political climate, we did ask this general mood, do you think things are getting better or worse? And late last year, the majority of people thought things were getting worse. A lot of people thought things were the same, and about a quarter of the people thought things were getting better. And there's a split by province there on the left. Western Cape was most dissatisfied, and the most satisfied was in Mpumalanga. So these are interesting questions digging into the regional differences. Limpopo, not very happy. Northern Cape, not very happy. I'm not going to go into any more detail. Now, the next question that we asked, because at this time there was a lot of, with the whole fees might fall activism, there's a lot of criticism of the Constitution. So we wanted to understand, what did people think of the Constitution? So we asked, of the people who had heard of the Constitution, we asked them, what do you think about it? We asked them, is it the best that we could have? And 61% said yes. About a third said no, and there were 12% that were unsure. So again, we thought this is interesting. Let's look at it from a provincial perspective. Do you think it is the best we could have? Western Cape said was the most negative about it. Most positive was Limpopo. We then broke it by race and age. There wasn't too much difference across race, but sort of hovered between 60 and 50%. Black African respondents were most in favor. Coloreds were the least. Indians and Asians and whites were about the same, hovering around 50%. Then age cohort, there were slight differences. Youngsters were more in favor, thought it was the best. There's a slight dip of middle-aged folk, and then it picks up again with older folk. By lived poverty index, people who were the most well off on the left, only 60% thought it was the best. For people who have the worst lived experience of poverty, 69% said yes, it is the best constitution we could have. Then in terms of democracy and human rights, we did ask this question, are you satisfied with the way democracy works in South Africa? And this was slightly disappointing. Almost 50% said either not at all or slightly. So there's a lot of skepticism about the health of our democracy. We then asked about the sorts of rights that we asked people, do you think these rights are respected in South Africa? Equality before the law was that was the right that people thought was the least respected, and that's problematic. For the CRL Commission, they'll be pleased to know that religious freedom was the right that people thought was the most respected. We also asked, do you think things have changed in these different categories between 1994 to the present day? Basic services, have they got better or worse? Most people thought they'd got better. But when it came to the economy, the last two rows there, economic circumstances and employment opportunities, there's a lot of skepticism about whether it's got better or worse. The next group of questions are to do with knowledge of the Commission, of the Constitution. We asked people who had heard of the Constitution. We assessed their understanding of the Constitution. So we asked them a number of questions, like can a province have its own constitution, for example, or can a province elect its own president? And then based on the number of right and wrong answers, we put together the score. And older folk understood very little about the Constitution. That's the top bar there. If you're 70 over, they scored the worst in understanding of the Constitution. But gratifyingly, it was the youth who understood it the best. The 18 to 19-year-olds in the last bar across the bottom there. By lived poverty index, people who suffered the most, the top row, you can see they had the least understanding of the Constitution, and on the bottom, people who had the least experience of poverty, they had a better understanding of it. Some attitudes towards human rights. There's a lot more in this report, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of interesting ones. Attitudes towards gender. Can a man beat his partner if she annoys him? 16% either agreed or strongly agreed with that. And then, fortunately, most folk answered that they disagreed. Primary health care role, the primary role for childcare is for women, split almost 50-50. This one was worrying. Married women can refuse their husband's sex. The majority of people agreed with that, which was disturbing. And also equally disturbing, are women as capable as men to head companies? Most people agreed with that statement. So that's, beg your pardon, that was the very few people disagreed with that one. Foreigners and jobs, this was an interesting one because the question about xenophobia was in everybody's mind. So we asked, do you agree with the statement that foreigners should not be allowed to live in South Africa because they take jobs and benefits away from South Africans? Most people disagreed with that. And then land and property, the last one I'm going to touch on here, is we asked, do you agree with the statement, no one should be able to take my land away? Most people agreed with that, but then most people agreed with the statement, land should be returned to black people. So that's an interesting finding for the debate that's going on at the moment. But a very worrying was these 18% of people who agreed with the statement, it is acceptable to burn government property. So that was worrying. Some observations, it's still very worryingly low. After 20 years, we still have the same low figure of understanding of the Constitution. And even more worrying that the people who most need of their rights to be protected have the least understanding. It is, as Yasmin said, the biggest data set of its kind, 2.3 million data points. So we can cut this in every which way we require. So we are calling, as Yasmin said, for abstracts. We are going to make the data available. We do call on researchers to then bring abstracts, and we hope to host a colloquium potentially this time next year. Yasmin, I hope it's not too soon. But we would like to pull these findings together into a set of academically rigorous reports for future publication. Thanks.
I guess we have more questions to yourselves. We don't have time. We'll then move on to respondents at this point. 5 minutes questions they're asking. Okay, is that all right? As long as people don't leave. All right, promise you won't leave. Okay, let's have questions then. 5 minutes, how many can you take? Please, let's just see how many people want to ask questions and comments. There's one. Then we'll give you the entire 5 minutes to ask. If they don't, yeah. Please give him a mic. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Hudson. I work with mining communities, and the organization is the Benchmarks Foundation. I'm so glad the European Union are funding this event, because it seems that when we're talking about illicit financial flows in Africa and how to deal with them with a binding treaty, the EU runs away from that. The reason I'm coming to this, Yasmin raised the issue about an enabling environment to fund these rights. But if most of the money is leaving because of corrupt corporations, right, and there's no means to regulate these, clearly our hands are tied. And the European Union are complicit in making sure that there's no treaty in dealing with these companies. If you want, I can give you the figures that are leaving this country illicitly. And our parliament tried to deal with this in September last year, and they say there are no prosecutions, there's nothing. An international treaty will help to make sure that these companies are accountable. Why don't we talk about corporations and their power to destroy the lives of many people in these rights? Many mining communities people talk about it every day. The water supply gets used up, the fisheries in West Africa gets taken up. So I really would like to hear from the EU. And they mustn't undermine the treaty process that's taking place in Geneva, please, because then you are not regarding human rights as indivisible. That's right.
Thank you. All right. Just press. Okay, you'll get another one.
Hi, my name is Tim Hudson. I work for the International Commission of Jurists. Thanks, Gerald, for the presentation and for all of the talks. The FHR is doing very commendable work in documenting the attitude and awareness to human rights in South Africa. But I have to say that the results of the survey are extremely concerning to me. And I just want to know, Gerald, if you can correct me here in the way that I understand these results. But in a sample of 25,000 people, the improvement of 4% from 47% of awareness of either of the Constitutional Bill of Rights is only 1,000 people. That's over 7 years. And what this means is that awareness, and the question that was asked is, are you aware of the existence of either the Constitution or the Bill of Rights? Many of the other questions then are only asked to people who do know about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which means that we have half of the country now, today, as a result of the cumulative efforts of civil society, government, the Human Rights Commission, who literally do not know that these documents exist, let alone what they can do to protect their rights, let alone what the specific rights in the Constitution are. And it makes me wonder how it is that we can possibly have informed and proper discussions about the issues that the survey raises. So the question and the challenge, I guess, to everybody from all of the organizations that we're in is, how is it that we are improving so little? Because it's very, very, very bad and very slow, if I understand those statistics correctly.
Thank you. Any other? Are you able to respond? Yasmin, you are being put on the spot. Okay. All right. 2 there. Yasmin, you are being put on the spot. Why is it that after so many years, we just have such a slight improvement? There are 2 hands there. Thank you. And then those will be the last, those 2 hands.
Thank you so much for that very good presentation. At least it gives us an insight of where we are. I think the first speaker said that no person is perfect, but it's working towards that perfection that really makes a difference. So for that, I mean, from 4,000 to 24,000, it is an improvement. But what I wanted also to ask is, does this, my name's Dr. Janet Rogers from the African Diaspora Development here in South Africa. I wanted to ask, does this survey, has it only been done in South Africa alone? And one question, does awareness, constitutional awareness, is it tied up to the development of the area that you have done your research? Because if people are not aware about their constitutional rights, the question is, are we having good governance, or what must we do in order to articulate it or put these constitutional rights as part of our school curriculum so that people can be aware? We may not be able to do much about the older generation, but at least the current generation, we can say that within the next 5 years, this is part of our school curriculum where children all across the board having a uniform curriculum will be aware of their constitutional rights, because without that, we are not going to go very far. And then the other question is, would this also be done in other African countries? Because if you look at a country like DRC, which is quite huge and has a lot of mines and a lot of raw resources, yet the people there are extremely, extremely poor. They are not able to have a right to those raw materials that are in their country. And yet we do have major corporations coming in and taking whatever they want and go across the sea, and they are not be able to be helped. How do we tie that in our African continent to tie the constitutional rights awareness to the development of the people through the raw resources that are found on the African continent? Because charity begins at home. You cannot tell me that you are giving me the crown and yet you keep the jewels of the crown. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You know, I think on Hudson's question, there's really been, I think, a divergence of opinions on the question of how we move forward on an accountability mechanism for corporates. Many, and I can't even remember the year when the foundation hosted Mary Robinson, who was leading the charge on the global front, which kind of led to the appointment of John Ruggie. And then we hosted John Ruggie in South Africa. And what John Ruggie came up with were the principles and guidelines. But even then we found that there was this major gap on how you hold corporations accountable. And that is why I think it was in 2015 we welcomed it when South Africa joined with Ecuador in proposing a resolution that we should go beyond the question of guidelines and studies, and that in fact we should develop a binding treaty or covenant. Now, of course, there's been a diversion of, or a difference of opinion between South Africa and Ecuador and the European Union and Norway, who were the co-sponsors of the other resolution, which was really looking at deepening the study. And when one looks at the situation in South Africa, particularly around mining, and of course the rest of the region, then one appreciates that under international law, very hard to hold corporations accountable unless you can link them directly to the violation. One of the indicators under this current program has also been how to develop a relationship between the corporate world and human rights. And while we've developed a number of tools, one of the difficulties we experience is actually getting corporates to attend these workshops and in fact to engage on the issue. So I would argue that this is conceivably probably one of the most important questions. And I think I raised when I spoke that one of the problems in South Africa is that the Constitution does have both vertical and horizontal application. But if you actually look at the kind of cases that we are taking to the courts, I would say that SASSA is probably, after Mazibuko, you know, one of the first on socioeconomic rights, but also one of the first which is beginning to identify the role of corporations. And of course, we've seen with the listerios, with the bread fixing, that much of this kind of accountability has been left to the competition tribunal, which is not really set up when you look at its mechanisms to actually deal with this. So it's also a question of civil society saying, how are we going to take these cases up? Because there's no doubt that the conditions that people live under in mining areas, the kind of leases that have been signed by chiefs, and when you read the former president's report, which has led to this question of the Ingonyama Trust being dissolved, what people forget that this was President de Klerk's parting gift to the new government, placing so much land in the hands of traditional leaders. And when you look at what they have done and how ordinary people don't actually have a title deed, then I think you see where we are going. I think on Tim's question, it's shocking, and it speaks, I think, to the question of understanding the kind of population that we're dealing with. Now, when you have a figure in the findings where half of South Africans don't have access to the internet, and even for those of us who have access to data bundles, how often is it when you can't have connectivity? So for me, there are two things we need to do. The one is to really look at the data question, but the other is to really support the work of groups like the Right to Know campaign, who have been really targeting many of the companies around the question of data in South Africa, because we also have to anticipate that when you look at young people, where are they getting their information from? They're not going to get it from reading or from written material. It is about what they see visually and what they can download. The other is the question of language. More and more we are picking up across the country that people want to be spoken to in their own language of choice. And I think that really poses challenges for all of us on how we do constitutional rights education. But you know, it's not enough to tell people you have a right. You also have to say to them, how can they realize that right? Where do they go to actually deal with their complaints, and who's going to take their issues up? And I think that's where, Bongani, we really have to look at this question of the role played by Chapter 9s, the role played by government, but also in the most rural dorpie in our country. What are we doing? In the advice offices that we support, we were quite shocked when we did this latest survey, because as you visit these advice offices, do you know what the most work is that they're doing? They're in the CCMA, protecting the rights of farm workers. And even as we speak as farm murders, and that's not to discount the importance of people's lives, but the reality of the plight of farm workers in our country also speaks to really looking at this question of protection and prevention, and I don't think we have it right yet. To our colleague from the Diaspora Organization, this survey is, of course, South Africa focused, but when you look at many of the participants in the survey, many of them come from other countries as well. And we really tried to look at this question of migration, the question of xenophobia too. So it's not, I mean, we haven't cut all the data in the kind of permutations we can, and that is why we want to throw it out there to other researchers, because what we really want to drill down to is a poverty analysis and a political economy analysis. And then the other question, which I think we all grapple with. We all argue that if you realize your rights, the quality of your life can improve. But I also think we need to show that empirically, and we're not quite yet there. So this is work in progress, not perfect, but let's see what we can do with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. I'll ask for the third session now, our respondents, Professor Majola from the South African Human Rights Commission, Dr. Pali Lihotla, a former statistician general, and our new board member, and Zaid, who is in this family. That's all I can say. You can't run away from us. Come Zaid, he was part of the group that worked on this as well. And as they sit, my response to the questions asked, especially on the mining sector, is that there is a recognition that when we had this constitution, we made assumptions. The assumptions we made was that everyone was reading from the same script, that we wanted to transform our society for the better. We've now learned that the goodwill was not there for those who wanted their bottom line. And so we have to really ask ourselves a very fundamental question. How do we get that goodwill from those who have the means? Because we can't continue to say the Constitution works and then people still live in those conditions that we are talking. It's not fair, period. So, over to you. What have you heard? What are your responses? What can you suggest going forward? Thank you. You can sit there, maybe, unless you want to stand. It's up to you. Maybe come. Thanks, Prof.
You're welcome. Wow, it's a very exciting afternoon, I must say. Program Director, thank you for the opportunity. I'd like just to greet the audience and also to express my greetings to the EU Ambassador, Ambassador Konaro, and the Special Representative, Mr. Lambrinidis. The two deputy ministers I see, one is still here, ambassadors who are here, representatives of civil society, government representatives, friends, ladies and gentlemen. The South African Human Rights Commission extends its appreciation and gratitude to the Foundation for Human Rights in collaboration with the Department of Justice for the invitation to attend the launch of the baseline survey today on the knowledge and understanding of constitutional rights awareness among South Africans. I congratulate them for undertaking this massive and impressive and challenging task and for completing it and delivering this highly important report. Baseline surveys are an important part of any monitoring and evaluation process. They are done to act as benchmarks for measuring project success or failure. The results of a baseline study can show some aspects of a project as needing more focus than others, while others may only need to be given little focus. I think that the baseline survey is going to help the Commission in a great way in that regard. A baseline study serves the purpose of informing decision makers what impact the project has had on the target communities, and I think that is what we are experiencing today with the very cursory look at the survey. The resources available to some of the Chapter 9 institutions supporting democracy does not often permit them to look back and find out what results have we produced through all the human rights education, advocacy work, litigation, engagement with government and other stakeholders, and through the implementation of all the programs aimed at promoting and protecting human rights. Indeed, in recognizing March 2018 as the Human Rights Month and 21 March as a Human Rights Day, main stakeholders, particularly the media, have posed the question which the South African Human Rights Commission has had a challenge in answering, namely, why does it appear as if there has been a regression in the promotion and protection of human rights in the country? Has the South African Human Rights Commission done enough? And has it been effective in doing its work? We need to ponder these questions, and I think the survey also will help us a great deal in that regard. This baseline survey is therefore of immense importance to the Chapter 9 institutions, particularly the Commission. Planning for the future requires detailed knowledge of our social realities, which this comprehensive baseline survey provides. It will be a useful tool to the new commissioners in planning the way forward, even though they are already of the impression that great emphasis needs to be put on the promotion and the protection of socio-economic rights. The major challenges and scourges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment facing us exist because persons do not have access to their socio-economic rights, which are guaranteed in the Constitution. Without the awareness of and access to basic capabilities, such as the right to food, water, shelter, sanitation, education, and health, people will not be able to take themselves out of poverty. Poverty and lack of education contribute to people worrying more about survival than about what the paper constitution provides. Because that document has not been made to demonstrate to them that knowing it and how to use it to own advantage have the benefit of attenuating their plight and reducing the inequality in which they languish, few will make the effort to actually know it or to know it well. A quick glance through the survey has convinced us that there is no doubt that more needs to be done around human rights awareness raising of the rights guaranteed in the Constitution and the realization in particular of socio-economic rights. I agree that as poverty levels increase, so does the awareness of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights decrease. It is now an established fact that the greater the inequality that exists within a society, the more socio-economic problems pertain. This ranges from distrust of the other, leading to xenophobia, attacks, and racism, to high rates of crime, and even to less innovation and development in society. The survey gives us a number of insights. There is a need, for example, to address poverty and enhance access to justice, to information, and to socio-economic rights. The strong correlation between the lack of awareness of constitutional rights, poverty, and race has remained a constant factor, one which needs to be addressed. There is a need to address the living conditions of our people in a way that reaffirms the constitutional vision. Raising awareness about the Constitution means that we have to strive to incorporate it into our daily lives. This entails making constitutional rights a lived reality. People can only depend on our Constitution if they have experienced the ways in which it can be instrumental in improving their own lives. We need, therefore, to start having ordinary conversations about the systemic nature of issues affecting human rights. Statistics are useful and very important. However, let us look at the reasons why the numbers are as they are. This affords us a moment of reflection. Let us take advantage of the information obtained from this survey by doing a proper introspection. We need to ask ourselves, why is it that an equal number of women, for example, and men believe that the primary role of caring for children should fall upon women? Is it because we teach our boys a certain kind of masculinity and we teach our girl children to aspire to be wives? Given that we inscribe gender roles to our children at such early stages, are we surprised at the results that we have obtained? These are the sorts of questions that we need to ask ourselves as we go forward. These conversations should not remain here in the elite circle, but should include ordinary people when we discuss them. It is our duty as Chapter 9 institutions and as government departments and civil society to ensure that hopes and ideals embodied in the Constitution are realized by our people. Accessibility to the Constitution is therefore important. Making justice accessible to ordinary people creates the desire to learn more about the Constitution, and it also increases people's confidence in the Constitution as well as its legitimacy amongst the especially ordinary people. Many constitutional literacy programs have focused on law students and have neglected the ordinary citizen on the streets and especially in the rural areas. There is no reflection as to why constitutional awareness is important to South Africa and why South Africa has such a low rate of constitutional knowledge and awareness. We need, therefore, to truly understand the causes of the problem before we can truly address it. We all know that it is hard to sell a constitutional book to someone who is hungry, homeless, and cannot read. By looking at the survey, we can see that socio-economic conditions play a significant factor in one's level of awareness. So, an awareness program should also address people's social conditions. We need to reconfigure our rights discourse and produce a living constitution. We need to make good on the constitutional promise. In this way, we will restore the people's hopes and faith in the Constitution. In this way, the Constitution assumes life and meaning for them. Else, it remains a distant document used by lawyers and advocates. Little is done to link constitutional rights with values that communities already live by, and with efforts already taken by communities to make life better for themselves and for others. Abahlali baseMjondolo came to mind. A demystified constitution is one which has meaning to all of us, irrespective of our social and economic conditions. That can be done by focusing on addressing the needs of the people. This is a task. The resources available to some of the Chapter 9. This is a task that should involve every government department and every Chapter 9 institution. Our ability to reach and effectively assist our people contributes in raising awareness and confidence levels in Chapter 9 institutions. This is currently happening at a slow pace because of the lack of cooperation from many quarters, including government departments. Chapter 9 institutions spend a lot of time trying to persuade or force government departments to cooperate with them in simple matters when that time should be spent servicing our people. There is thus the need for greater cooperation all round. Chapter 9 institutions also need to realize the importance of civil society, and they need to strengthen our working relationships with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me borrow the greetings that have been applied at the beginning and save a bit of time. I thought that the presentation, particularly from the Deputy Minister to the Ambassador to the area where I thought I'm excellent, were well received. And my departure from Stats SA was quite timely because the rendition of sampling theory and how you understand field operations was just too excellent, and I doubt if I can match it. So age has saved me from the embarrassment of competing with yourselves. I had to retire. So what this does is really creating a conversation that South Africa needs. And these numbers provide the platform for a very rich conversation that we should have. Oftentimes, as a statistician general, and my successor probably, we find ourselves confronted with a situation where we have to ask whether we have taste buds in this, whether we have processes by which we can explain the numbers. Some amongst our society believe that statisticians should not explain the data but must just leave it there for others to use. I always thought that a priest is not an altar boy, and a priest must converse the word. Of course, the priest has to know the limits, that he cannot usher punishment that is left to God. So as a statistician general, I had advanced the process of ensuring that the priest does what the priest has to do, to put the word and make others understand the word, without necessarily dabbling into policy. But the main issue that challenges us here is poverty of thoughts. And indeed, we have to be immersed in poverty of thoughts, because what time do you have when your concern would be the next meal? Or how long will your state pension will carry you? You really cannot engage actively when you are living under those kinds of conditions. And the correspondence of this poverty of thought, not of thoughtlessness, but of thought, corresponds appropriately with the lack of awareness of the Constitution. And I think we have to take people from where they are by providing the necessary tools to ensure that they can advocate actively, including in their poverty of thought, because it's not poverty of thoughtlessness, poverty of thoughtfulness, but it's just poverty of thought because of time limits. I think the baseline information is very important, but like one meal, it will never sustain you. You need longitudinal surveys so that there's a meal, there's prediction that there's a meal ahead. Only a greedy man eats once. I am a member of the International Accountability Panel appointed by Ban Ki-moon. There are 10 of us. It's in the independent accountability panel, and its basic tenets are human rights, and it's for accountability of children, mothers, and adolescents. And one of the things that we are looking at this year is accountability of the private sector. And South Africa's historians and the ECD provide a very interesting situation, tragic as it might be, but actually opens the world to these kinds of behaviors of the private sector. I would imagine that from the question that was asked, the Sustainable Development Goals provide a platform around which we can rally through this survey that South Africa has undertaken, and therefore provides the platform for other African countries. And the lodging of this in the context of the Statistical Harmonization for Africa, SHASA, which I chaired over the years I was Statistician General, provides us the platform to ask the question whether the heights we reach are the heights we keep as Africans. Because the SHASA, if it was the tree along which you could climb, the question is the SHASA still there? Is it still strong? Ask me, my answer will be, we are weak on the knees and we are about to die. So you are leaning against a very difficult problem. And as Africans, we must ask that question, whether the heights we reach are the heights we keep. We don't, unfortunately. Obviously, well, I don't want to talk about the study design. Really, you have done a fantastic job in terms of the study designs. What I was very interested in was the correspondence of the numbers. Minister Nel here knows that his department in the 90s, early 2000, COCTA, we are asking about service delivery to the nation. And we got responses from them. And we are surprised by the fact that numbers don't lie. But when they are that precise, then you start worrying. So we asked, what are your sources? They said, of course, the census. So they just recycled the census information and brought it back to us. But you presented very elegantly how you went about the design and how you triangulated and compared the results. The use of technology is very important, but we also know that these days there is no buzzer at the door. So the technology cannot make you enter the door. It's very, very difficult. We are going through a very difficult situation around how we keep the conversations alive. And indeed, they are very, very important conversations. These are things that people in statistics confront all the time. The vibrancy of society, I think, the issue of the AG, of our democracy, it's about human agency, the ability to know that you can't fear your job. When you sit there, or not when you sit there, but when you occupy that space, you mustn't fear your job. And Tulima Donzela proved to us that we could know that there's something called the public protector. It's an issue of human agency and leadership. It's central to this. But individuals come and go. What we need are systems and institutions, but human agency is very, very critical. There are institutions of the state that are in comatose because the human agency doesn't exist. And we really have to hit it at the human agency issue. Mpumalanga, I wrote in my article, why did DD become deputy president? I don't know, I still don't know. But the data says that Mpumalanga people are happier. The data in poverty shows that only in Mpumalanga did poverty decline all the time. And the poor, while I've said it's poverty of thought and not poverty of thoughtlessness, they have a way of deciding when they see the benefits. Just as Amilcar Cabral said, people don't vote for things in your head. It is when the material conditions of people on the ground change. And in Mpumalanga, I must tell you, consistently, even with these kinds of problems that we had, poverty in Mpumalanga continued to decline. And of course, data can be very humiliating, and we have to confront it, particularly in the era of post-truths, own facts, and alternative facts. We need to get and face the data. We must look into the data. We cannot do without looking at these facts. They must tell us what it is, and you need civil servants or technocrats who will talk truth to power. At times we roll ourselves with politicians and they roll out themselves with the technocrats. In the end, accountability is lost. Observation and monitoring can play a role, but it's not sufficient. It needs joint assurances. And without remedy, accountability is nothing. Accountability is accountability when there is remedy. I thank you very much.
Thank you. So I suppose there's a short response to the survey, which is really well done. I think it's an excellent piece of work. And as Gerald says, it sets the stage for a lot of work that has to come to make sure that the results begin to be applied. And one of those areas in which it has to be applied, and it's a little bit of a history lesson for us, is that pre-1994 we didn't have a lot of information about attitudes to constitutional rights because we didn't have a constitution. The constitution was promulgated in 1994, 1995, and those of you who are around can remember some of the intensive effort that went into communicating the importance of the Constitution and the content of the Constitution. And here we are 20-odd years later, and the numbers seem to show that the effort has stalled, that we've hit 50% and stopped. But that educational process post-1994 took place in a very different world. The genocide in Rwanda, for those of you who can remember, was intimately linked to radio communication. the use of radio stations to spread messages of hate. I think the story that will emerge from Myanmar and the Rohingya is the effect and the role that Facebook played in spreading messages of hate and mobilizing people's activities. Part of the problem we face now is that we have the same tools. We have mass media communication, we have newspapers, we have radios, we have lower level activities like community mobilization and community-led organizations. And it's not a sense that these things are bad, but the data seems to show that there is a limitation, that there's a limit against which we are not making an effect with those interventions. And we're faced with a very real problem that as level of internet access increases, we are increasingly going to outsource the main modes of communication to international entities that have a very different set of values. Most of you have seen in the news the brouhaha about Cambridge Analytica and the events that have taken place in the US and the UK elections. Those techniques were trialed and refined in the third world by those very firms. Changing people's minds, spreading fake news is an activity that has been trialed and tested in the third world on countries like ours. And the effects only become evident and people stand up and shout about them when they start to impact on first world politics. So we're in a situation here where we have to take this survey and understand it and analyze it, but it has to be a spur to action. It certainly can't be the pathology of analysis where we, as necessary as it may be, cut up this data and think about what has happened, because the world is changing around us and we need to find innovative ways to combat what is going to happen in this country as it's happened elsewhere, as we've in fact seen with WMC leaks and those activities, the very first signs of what will happen, that the job of human rights education is going to be outsourced to entities over which we have no control. It's a baseline survey, and the Statistician General has talked about the wealth of data that Stats South Africa has produced on basic facts like access to services. And it's something of an indictment that we haven't had studies of this scale about our democratic process and attitudes to human rights. And if it remains a baseline survey, if we don't spend the immense time and effort in repeating it, we run the real risk. I mean, there's maybe not amongst this group, but there's an assumption that the arc of history moves forward, that this is a sort of ratchet effect. 47%, we do stuff and it increases. Maybe it increases to 48%, to 51%, but that's no longer true. We need continuous monitoring so that we can be aware when things start to slip, when attitudes to human rights start to regress, which is a very real possibility, despite our best efforts, that we can serve as an early warning system about the dangers to our democratic process. So it's important that it's done. It's important that we continue to analyze this information, but it's even more important that we use it to spur some creative thinking about what we do next. Because certainly if this is not to say that we should stop the things that we've done, but certainly if we stand pat and say, this is what we're going to do for the next 5 years, when the next meeting like this happens, it might not be half as pleasant, the circumstances in which we we talk about human rights. So certainly there's an obligation on our international partners, but also on the South African government, on civil society, on business, to make sure that this sort of information is constantly collected and updated. We can't be sanguine about human rights. The world is not going to stand still and allow us to slowly reflect on what we've achieved. Thank you.
At this point, we have a short inset for us to just get an experience of what we as the foundation are also trying to do, to use technology to reach out to younger people in schools. And so, are we ready for it? Yes. So we'll maybe, thank you very much. Can we give them a round of applause? We will then have a look at it, and thereafter we'll have a vote of thanks. I hope the vote of thanks is ready. Thank you. The DM has agreed, so we'll have that, and then we will close. Over to you. And please give us feedback. If you see it and you think we can tweak it here and there, feel free to say maybe it will reach people better if you do A, B, C, and D. It's up to you. We'll have how many? 2. We'll have 2, but we are planning to have how many? 8. We'll have 18 of them. Thank you.
They used to separate us, restrict us, and made us unequal. But South Africa changed, and our laws had to change to match our values, which resulted in our constitution. It gives people rights. Allows us to right the wrongs of the past, and is designed to change South Africa for the better through overcoming poverty and inequality, by providing better access to education, shelter, food, and water. The Constitution applies to everyone in South Africa. No one is above it, not even the president. And all our other laws have to abide by our Constitution. So with the legal foundation set, we were able to begin building a more equal society.
As we close a chapter of exclusion and a chapter of heroic struggle, we reaffirm our determination to build a society of which each of us can be proud. As South Africans, as Africans, and as citizens of the world.
The laws used to be really unfair in South Africa. They treated us unfairly because of the way we looked, our sex or gender, our disabilities, and even because of who we loved. But now everyone has the constitutional right to be treated equally. So we're all equal now, right? Well, not yet. Even though the discriminatory laws of the past are gone, their effects are still felt today. Like how, in the past, some received an education which led to skilled work, whereas others didn't. Or how access to quality education is highly likely for some and unlikely for others. And even if they do have access, the effects of the past may make it difficult for them to succeed. For example, the ongoing inequality in our society makes it harder to finish school. How much harder will it be for someone to find work without basic or higher qualifications? In the past, only some people could go wherever they wanted. The rest of us had to stay where we were told, which led to some people being able to stay close to job opportunities and others not so much. So in order for us to have equality in South Africa, we need to make sure that the laws change the patterns of the past, like the idea that some work is only suitable for some people, or how some forms of belonging are preferred over others, or how only certain kinds of love are acceptable to others, or how some looks are more acceptable than others. So in summary, past laws and their effects, as well as the way we treat and think of one another, all result in inequality, which is why our Constitution treats people differently, to protect those who have been treated unfairly, so that one day equality will mean equal treatment and opportunity for all.
I'm Silo Mokumalo. I'm from a township called Claremont in Durban. I'm a person with a disability. The right to equality is a very important right in our Constitution. It's even more important for me as a person with a disability because disability is one of the listed ground. As a result, I have had access to education. I have finished my tertiary level education and I'm currently employed as a law clerk at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Without having had access to equal right to education, I would not have been where I am. I encourage that everybody who feels unfairly discriminated or unfairly treated approach the Equality Court in order to exercise their rights.
These are the two pilots, and we would welcome, I think, comment from people. We also, as the chair said, we're going to do 18 of them. They will come in different languages, and we're going to be distributing them in schools with the teacher's guide, and we will be running workshops for teachers so that they can actually use them in the classroom. We'll also be putting them out through the SABC, through community television, community radio, because there's an accompanying radio series as well. And I think we're all excited about it. When you look at the characters, they were also developed by one of South Africa's most famous cartoon artists. And this had the general support and of the young people in our office who were the sort of guinea pigs when we tested this. And so we're very excited about being able to put it out because honestly, if we're going to make a difference, and I think Zaid warned about the dangers. I mean, we all know the role that Bell Pottinger played in really fueling racial hatred. And so we have to occupy that space, and we can do that through the schools. And this animation series, I hope, will become part of the human rights curriculum. So thank you to John over there at the back, who's been part of developing it, and Ahmed for nursing this project along. But as I've said, feedback is welcome. So we can actually feed that into the next series as well. And they will be available for free. They're going to be translated into different languages and distributed all over the country. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your patience. I'll now call upon the Deputy Minister, Andrew Snell, to thank you all.
Thanks. Program Director, thank you very, very much. I think let me discharge my mandate immediately and upfront and really thank the excellent work that has been done by the Foundation for Human Rights in partnership with the Department of Justice and Correctional Services, the European Union, and a team of really, really excellent researchers. And then the very insightful inputs by the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, by the former Statistician General, and Dr. Zaid Kimi. This research really, I think as government, we need to welcome this excellent work. It comes at a very, very crucial time. It comes at that point where next year we will be celebrating 25 years of democracy. And I think the celebration that we need is not an uncritical and a shallow celebration, but indeed a critical celebration that demonstrates and underscores the seriousness with which we take our democracy and the progress that we've made in realizing the vision contained in our Constitution. It comes 7 or 8 years after we have adopted a national development plan. This data gives us very, very valuable material with which to evaluate whether we are on track with the implementation of that national development plan. It also comes at a time in our country's history where we've gone through some difficult times. And I think, as many speakers have pointed out, that one of the positive aspects of those difficult times is that we've seen that indeed our institutions, our constitutional institutions, have proved to be very, very resilient. And they've done the things that they were designed to do. We also will be celebrating the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela. And I think much of this work reminds me of something that Nelson Mandela said in 1993 already, before the 94 elections. He said, "We do not want freedom without bread, nor do we want bread without freedom." And I think this research really talks to both bread and to freedom, to the delivery of services, but also the state of our democracy. And coming from the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, we are very thankful for the emphasis placed by the report on both citizen attitudes towards the delivery of basic services, but also how local government as an institution is functioning. I found it very revealing that according to the survey, according to citizens, 33% of citizens are either very or somewhat satisfied with local government, 27% are slightly satisfied, and 38% are not satisfied at all. That mirrors almost exactly the analysis that COGTA did in 2014 before we adopted, that led to the adoption of the Back to Basics approach, where we analyzed every single municipality in South Africa. We came to the conclusion that they could be classified into 3 broad categories of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 doing well, some excellently, 1/3 getting many of the basics right, but needing assistance in crucial areas, and 1/3 of our municipalities, quite frankly, being dysfunctional, leading to the adoption of the Back to Basics approach, premised on 6 pillars. And it relates very closely to the research. Firstly, putting people first. How do we ensure that municipalities function with the realization in everything that they do that they are there to serve people? Municipalities are there to serve people. People are not there to serve municipalities. So how you go about governing, how you go about delivering services, everything must put citizens at the center. Secondly, the ability by municipalities to deliver a basic basket of quality services in an uninterrupted manner. Thirdly, the ability of municipalities to practice good governance. And good governance includes the involvement of citizens in the planning and the execution of those plans. Fourthly, practicing sound financial management, being transparent, realizing the money that you use in local government or anywhere in government for that matter is not your money. It's money that comes from citizens. And it must be spent in a way that generates the maximum value for citizens and in a way that is where we can be accountable for that money. Fifth, that we develop strong and resilient, capable and resilient institutions at local government level. That capability includes the capability of the state at a local government level to conduct the citizen participation and consultation processes that are truly meaningful. And sixth, engendering local economic development. I think this work also ties in very strongly, and I think the videos that you showed right at the end also touched, amongst others, the importance of the question of transforming apartheid spatial patterns. Something which I found very interesting in the research. Also, the diversity of opinion according to place and space. It's proven to be one of the most difficult legacies of apartheid to reverse. Because very often, in a well-intentioned way of meeting basic services, we've gone about reinforcing apartheid spatial patterns through the choices that we've made in where we've built houses, where we've delivered those basic services. And I think that's fundamental to both fostering national unity, but also to creating inclusive growth. A point that emerges not so strongly from the research itself, but which is touched upon and which emerged from the discussion here is the very important question of how we ensure both the vertical as well as the horizontal application of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Our Constitution is very often attacked as a document of compromise. I think we continuously neglect to understand the truly revolutionary character of the document that we adopted in 1996, that came into force in 1996. It's a constitution that provides not only for the enforcement of rights by citizens against the state, but amongst citizens themselves. And I don't think that we've done nearly enough, either as government or as civil society, to realize the potential of our Constitution to hold private power, and in our case, private racialized power, to account and to transform that power. Which brings me to my last point, in that I think to do that would require the building and the strengthening of partnerships, of alliances, and ultimately the building of a strong social compact. And I think the work that has been done through the collaboration of the Foundation for Human Rights, the Department of Justice, and the EU demonstrates what exactly is possible when we apply our minds to that. And I think it lays a foundation for us to carry on the good work. To paraphrase my favorite German philosopher, who in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach said that philosophers have interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. I suppose ex-former statistician general, the same could be said, that statisticians have hitherto measured the world. The point, however, is to change it. I think this work gives us the foundation to start making that, or to continue making that change. Thank you very much.
GM, thank you very much for those words. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our program. We are available as the foundation if you want further information, and we are urging you to use the information we have given you in your small groups, in your organizations, so that we can see to what extent we move. We move from 51%, so that, as is being said, people are actually able to use the instrument, our Constitution, to get their dignity back. Thank you very much. The refreshments are served outside. It's written here, light refreshments. So I hope it's light enough to give you energy to drive safely home. Thank you.